If the witnesses and members would all take your seats at this time. This is a hearing on oversight of U.S. sanctions policy. And this morning the committee continues to examine the administration's use of sanctions authorized by Congress to address threats from hostile states, including Iran, North Korea, and Russia. As I noted at our last hearing, no matter how tough the language of our sanctions bills, they are only as strong as their enforcement. That's why I'm glad we're joined today by two administration officials directing our teams on the front lines of this fight. Assistant Secretaries Singh and Billingsley, your assessments and your leadership are critical here. I know I speak for all the members of this committee in saying that I appreciate the magnitude of the threats you deal with every day in your position. But the question is, are we doing enough? Congress has acted in a bipartisan way to provide the administration with new tools to combat and disrupt and deter those who would do America harm. The Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which was authored by myself and Mr. Elliott Engel, empowered the administration with some of the most potent weapons yet. And to its credit, the administration has acted. Since January 2017, more than 200 Russian individuals and entities have been designated for sanctions under CAATSA and other existing laws. Hundreds of millions of dollars in assets have been blocked. That said, we should be doing more. We should be doing more to hold Putin accountable for his aggressive acts, including attacks on our democracy. The administration should use authorities included in Section 228 of CAATSA to cast a wider net. Those still engaged in significant business with designated Russian individuals and entities need to pay a price, as the law prescribes. We cannot expect Vladimir Putin and his corrupt associates to change their behavior in Syria, in Ukraine, or anywhere else until we prove we will hold them to account. I can't understand why action has not been taken, for example, against the Russian entities that provide material support to Iran's Mahan Air. This sanctioned Iranian airline reportedly transports weapons and personnel to Syria and still maintains routes with St. Petersburg and with Moscow. We should be examining and designating the Russian individuals and companies that support Mahan with maintenance, with ticket services, with cargo sales, and with more. And this is low-hanging fruit. In the months ahead, the committee will continue to work with the administration on this and other sanctions policy, including implementation of the executive order announced yesterday regarding election interference. And we'll be watching to see that another tranche of sanctions is imposed against Russia later this year for its use of a military-grade nerve agent on British soil in March. Putin will certainly be looking for any signs that the U.S. is wavering. And that goes for North Korea, too. I'm very concerned that our maximum pressure campaign is faltering. Kim appears to be using talks, as he has time and time again, to probe for weaknesses and to buy time. When our messages are confusing or contradictory, we shouldn't be surprised when others like Beijing reportedly resume importing North Korean coal. Sanctions are not a silver bullet. They don't work alone or instantly. They are best done with others. They can be overdone, harming the wrong people. But when deployed thoughtfully and deployed consistently with maximum pressure on those entities, sanctions are powerful diplomatic tools. Our goal here is to leverage America's economic might to peacefully and effectively counter urgent threats to our national security. If we're going to succeed, the administration needs to fully utilize the tools that Congress has provided. With that said, I think we will go to an introduction of the witnesses, and I think Mr. Engel intended to make an opening statement, but if you would like, Mr. Sherman, I will defer to you when he arrives. He's
as long as he has his time to give an opening statement when he arrives.
He certainly does.
Good.
And, I've communicated that. He is stuck in traffic at this moment. So we'll go now to an introduction of our witnesses. So I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Manisha Singh, Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, and Mr. Marshall Billingsley, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing, to the committee here today. Manisha Singh has been serving in her post since November of 2017. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Economic, Energy, and Business Affairs and as Deputy Chief Counsel to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Marshall Billingsley has been serving in his post since June of 2017, and prior to his current role, Mr. Billingsley was the Managing Director with Deloitte Financial Advisory Services. He has held multiple positions within the Departments of Defense and Department of State, and we appreciate both of them being here with us today. Without objection, the witness's full prepared statement is going to be made part of the record. Members here are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any additional questions to you or any extraneous material for the record. So if you would, Ms. Singh, please summarize your remarks. We'll begin with you.
Thank you. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today regarding the administration's sanctions policy. As the head of the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, I will address from a foreign policy perspective how the Trump administration is employing sanctions as a critical component of our national security. The State Department works closely with our allies and partners to ensure that diplomatic pressure is applied with strength, unity, and consensus. President Trump's national security strategy declares that we will deploy economic pressure on security threats and that we will use existing and pursue new economic authorities and mobilize international actors to increase pressure on threats to peace and security in order to resolve confrontations short of military action. We appreciate the opportunity to work with Congress to shape and craft these authorities in a manner which will achieve American national security objectives. Russia poses a threat to our national security on many fronts. Our sanctions programs have imposed substantial costs on Vladimir Putin and serve to deter the nefarious activities under his regime. We have witnessed Russian aggression globally, threatening our partners and allies, threatening our very own democratic process here at home. U.S. sanctions are intended to heighten the pressure and curb Russian destructive activities worldwide. Specifically, the Trump administration has sanctioned a total of 229 individuals and entities for their involvement in Russia's dangerous behavior. Notably, 136 of these designations were imposed under sanctions authorities codified by CATSA. These actions have sent a stark message that those who support election interference, human rights abuses, and other malign activity will suffer severe consequences. Another nefarious regime where economic penalties are a key tool to force behavioral change is Iran. Sanctions on the Iranian regime have crippled their government by preventing access to the global financial system and by deterring its capacity to destabilize. On May 8th, President Trump announced that the U.S. was ceasing its participation and the flawed Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Secretary Pompeo has formed an Iran Action Group and outlined 12 specific changes in Iranian behavior, which are detailed in my testimony for the record. Teams from the State Department and the Treasury Department have now visited over 30 countries around the world, engaging with our partners and allies on a new strategy for dealing with Iran. The Iranian regime has a choice to make: either come to the table to resolve these issues diplomatically or face unrelenting economic pressure. If we see the fundamental desired changes in behavior, only then will we consider easing the pressure of sanctions. Turning to North Korea, our severe economic pressure continues and has yielded the outcome of the first meeting between a North Korean leader and a U.S. president. The Trump administration is committed to working towards a complete, verifiable, irreversible, denuclearized North Korea. Secretary Pompeo has an unwavering commitment to this result. The administration has a number of sanctions authorities that apply to the DPRK. These authorities limit its access to technology and equipment that could be used to support its WMD and missile programs and hold the regime accountable for its widespread human rights abuses. We have urged all United Nations member states to take firm action in applying pressure to the DPRK. International solidarity and continued pressure are imperative until the DPRK denuclearizes. Turning to the Western Hemisphere, in Venezuela, we are using sanctions to address the Maduro regime's authoritarian rule. Our goal is to create the conditions for restoration of democracy in the interest of the Venezuelan people. Let me also note the administration's commitment to fully implement the Global Magnitsky Human Rights and Accountability Act, which advances the best of America's values abroad. I've listed a few examples from the many actions the Trump administration has taken to utilize sanctions pressure as an instrument of powerful diplomacy. We look forward to continuing to work with you to ensure that sanctions remain an effective tool which work in the interest of American national security. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Zing. We'll go now to Mr. Billingsley.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. It's great to be back here with the committee today to discuss how the Treasury Department is using our authorities in support of our national security strategy and our foreign policy. It's a broad waterfront to cover. We're talking about Iran, North Korea, and Russia, among many other topics today, and so I will attempt to touch on each of these briefly. Each of these countries poses its own unique particular challenge to the United States and our allies in the international order, but there are some common threads that link the three together. Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, and they continue to fund groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, and they bankroll the Syrian regime's slaughter of its people while continuing to advance their own missile program and sow regional instability. Russia, on the other hand, is providing weaponry and defense material to Iran and extensive support to the Syrian regime that enables Assad's brutal targeting of his own citizens. And further, Russia continues its occupation of Ukraine and Crimea and subversion of Western democracies, and it remains a very permissive environment for North Korean procurement efforts to circumvent the UN Security Council's resolutions and our own actions. And then, of course, North Korea continues to attempt to evade international sanctions and pressure and has not yet abandoned its weapons of mass destruction or missile programs. So on the one hand, all three of these countries use similar tactics to exploit the global financial system, particularly as they establish and employ front and shell companies. They try to mask the origin of the beneficial ownership associated with illicit flows and to disguise the nature and the intent behind certain transactions. And very importantly, all three collude with one another in an effort to blunt the effectiveness of our actions. But on the other hand, these three countries are very dissimilar in terms of the size of their respective economies and the extent to which they have businesses intertwined with global supply chains and in the degree to which their financial sectors are connected to the global system. And for these various reasons, our sanctions programs have to be nuanced and have to be tailored to address each of these challenges. I'm going to touch briefly on all three countries. First, on Iran. As the Assistant Secretary of State mentioned, the President's decision on May 8 has now set in motion the reimposition of a wide range of sanctions. And this is occurring over a 180-day period that were structured in 2 phases. And the intent here was to give businesses, global businesses, a chance to wind down their business operations with the Iranians prior to the full imposition of sanctions on November 4. On November 4, we will reimpose far-reaching sanctions on Iran's energy and shipping sectors and on foreign financial institutions that conduct business with the Central Bank of Iran and other designated Iranian banks. And we're going to very aggressively enforce these authorities. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned in your opening comments Mahan Air, and I could not agree with you more. It's not just Mahan flying in. Mahan is the airline of choice for the Quds Force. When they want to move weaponry, money, foreign fighters, Mahan Air is by and large the airline they select for these operations. It's their covered air asset program. We need to go after Mahan, and we are going after general service providers and third parties imposing secondary sanctions. You mentioned Section 228. Secondary sanctions are a very powerful tool, and we have begun designating companies that foolishly remain intertwined with Mahan Air. We did so in the case of Malaysia. Other actions are imminent. I also find it objectionable that certain countries who are close partners of ours, who are threatened by the Iranians, continue to allow Mahan to fly into their cities in the Middle East. And so this is a matter we very much see eye to eye on, and we will continue to target. Our efforts, together with Iranian economic mismanagement and corruption, are already generating results. And I show for the committee here today, I think, one of the most important financial metrics to keep your eye on in the coming days, and that is the value of the Iranian rial as compared to the U.S. dollar. We have never seen a precipitous drop like this in the history of our sanctions programs on Iran. The Iranian rial is now trading somewhere around 140,000 to the dollar. It's lost more than 2/3 of its value. And why this is important is that the supreme leader has got to make a choice. He can either take his scarce dollars and euros, his hard currency, to prop up his rial, or he can continue to allow Qasem Soleimani and the Quds Force to loot the central bank, to divert money, $700 million a year they give to Hezbollah alone. But they can't have it both ways. He's got to make a choice, and we intend to force him into that decision. Very briefly, turning to Russia, the Assistant Secretary has summarized our actions on Russia. We have sanctioned 212 Russia-related individuals and entities, and we have targeted key sectors of their economy. On April 6th, we designated 7 of the big fish oligarchs. These are individuals that the previous administration was unwilling to touch, but we did reach out and touch them in a very clear fashion. And our actions have undeniably been felt. When we took that action, the Russian stock market experienced its biggest plunge in 4 years, and the ruble still has not recovered its value. Oleg Deripaska, one of the elites who serves as a major proxy for the malign activities of the Kremlin, has seen his estimated net worth cut in half. Others, like Victor Vekselberg, have lost $3 billion as a result of our actions. On North Korea, I have to assure you, Mr. Chairman, we are not faltering on the economic pressure campaign. We are not stepping away from this one iota. The pressure is on, and we continue to ramp up pressure to combat North Korean efforts to evade sanctions. We are very focused on deceptive shipping practices in particular, and ship-to-ship transfers of oil and coal to get around the UN Security Council's embargoes on those products. And we have, you will have seen since August that nearly every single week we are targeting entities involved in helping the North Koreans evade these sanctions. In fact, today we are issuing designations just about now, at this moment, on a number of entities that are employing North Korean slave labor in the IT sector. And these companies are located in Russia and China, but we have in recent days designated a Russian bank for facilitating trade with the North Koreans. We designated a port operator that was willingly helping circumvent the shipping sanctions and so on. So we will continue this economic pressure campaign until denuclearization is achieved. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, my written testimony contains a great deal of additional details. I'm pleased that you incorporated that in the record, and I look forward to answering all questions from the committee.
We thank you, Mr. Billingsley. On August the 8th, because of this committee's persistence, the administration announced new sanctions on Russia for its poisoning of a British citizen and the poisoning of his daughter. And as you know, another British citizen lost their life as a result. And that poisoning was with a chemical nerve agent. This poisoning was an outrageous act that demands a strong response. Under the Chemical and Biological Weapons and Warfare Elimination Act of 1991, if Russia does not take certain steps by November, including allowing the UN or other international observers to conduct on-site inspections, the administration will have to impose additional, more severe sanctions on Moscow. Should Russia not take the steps necessary required under the Chemical and Biological Weapons Act, as we all suspect they will not, is the administration prepared to take the strongest necessary action? And that means, for example, things like an export ban or an import ban, air transportation ban, bank loan prohibitions. I would ask you, Ms. Singh, if you would give me your observations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. We are well aware of the impending deadline on the second tranche of sanctions to be issued against Russia under the CBW. We are watching their actions. We have indicated to them that they can make themselves not subject to these sanctions if they allow the on-site inspections, as you've indicated, if they give us a verifiable assurance that they will not use these nerve agents against their own people again. They have not done so far. So to that extent, we are looking at this November deadline as absolutely we plan to impose a very severe second round of sanctions under the CBW. The global community will not tolerate behavior such as we've seen from Russia, especially in poisoning and killing its own citizens.
Thank you. On North Korea, while we can be hopeful, so far there has been little progress towards North Korean denuclearization. We must keep up the pressure on the North Korean regime if we're to have a chance at getting a good deal. And to that end, Title III of the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act requires that the administration designate the shipping registries of countries that deliberately do not comply with UN security resolutions, barring trade with North Korea, and you addressed that, Mr. Billingsley. You mentioned actions the administration has taken, and let me also add, I find effective the focus on North Korean slave labor, given the amount of hard currency, since those workers are fed, but the money, the check, goes to the regime and ends up going towards their military programs. That is an effective program. But when will the administration begin implementing sanctions against not just the shipping registries of individual companies, but the shipping registries of governments? And let me explain where I'm going there. We're not talking here about shippers. We're talking about governments that knowingly violate these UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, and that is a twofer in this case, because it puts the pressure on Pyongyang, but it also puts the pressure on Tehran, since Tehran is involved in that kind of work. I wanted to ask you if the administration will consider blacklisting Iran's shipping registry due to their deliberate violations of such resolutions that have been passed at the UN level, Security Council level.
Chairman, thanks for that question. The short answer is that many countries have different ways that they maintain shipping registries. In some cases, it's even a commercial vendor that provides the registering process. I've been active with a number of the countries that are flags of convenience nations, such as Panama and others, to identify specific vessels that we know are in fact owned and operated by North Korean shell companies, to get them to immediately deregister, deflag, delist these companies. And I think we've had, together with the Department of State, a very high success rate when we have the facts at our disposal.
Panama is complying with your request at this moment?
Panama's done a great job on this. We see them pop up in Micronesia a fair amount now, and we're working very closely with the Australians and the New Zealanders on that. We also are designating specific companies and their ships. We just went after a Russian company and 6 of its vessels for engaging, again, in this ship-to-ship transfer behavior, which is the primary method by which North Korea is undercutting the intent of the Security Council. We have got to clamp down on these ship-to-ship transfers in open waters.
I will be in further discussions with you about the Iranian government's shipping registry on this issue as we press this point.
Thanks, Chairman. That's a good point, because on November 4, we are reimposing sanctions on the Iranian shipping lines, Erisal and some of the other associated companies.
All right. Let's go to Mr. Elliot Engel of New York for his opening statement, and then afterwards for his questions of the witnesses. And I thank you both for your testimony here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling today's hearing, and Assistant Secretary Singh and Assistant Secretary Billingsley, welcome, and thank you for your service and your time this morning. We appreciate having administration witnesses here, but if I have to be honest, I have to say it happens too rarely. Since coming into office, frankly, the administration has been increasingly reluctant to work with Congress. That's how it seems to us, and it's very, very frustrating, but we're happy you're here. The latest example pertinent to our conversation this morning was the development of this week's executive order on sanctions. There was no discussion of this effort with Congress whatsoever. We learned about it from Reuters, and from what I hear, your agencies were caught equally by surprise, and obviously that's not the way it's supposed to work. So I want to use this time that we do have administration officials before our committee to tackle this important topic. Sanctions can be a very effective tool to achieve our foreign policy objectives, but I'm concerned that this administration is turning reflexively to sanctions instead of taking the harder look at how they should fit into a broader strategy. Sanctions are a tool. They are not by themselves a strategy. I'm also troubled by the administration's reliance on using unilateral sanctions without developing support among our friends and allies. It's a standard practice, apparently. I don't know why. We need to check in with other governments that share our priorities. The power of sanctions is obviously amplified when we build support among other countries. When we act alone, without consulting our partners, we run the risk of them in turn acting in ways that undercut our goals. And for example, Iran. We pulled out of the nuclear deal and sort of left our partners and allies sort of twisting in the wind. Now, I didn't vote for the Iran deal. I was not happy with it, but it became the law, and we were pursuing it. And now going against our allies and isolating us instead of isolating Iran, I think is the wrong way to go. So facing the threat of U.S. sanctions, it seems to me we've pushed foreign governments closer to Tehran rather than further away from Tehran. These are the same allies who stood beside us as we dialed up pressure on Iran. And so by embracing a unilateral sanctions approach without a clear objective, we created a situation I believe counterproductive to our own policy goals, and I'm concerned that we still don't have a clear long-term strategy for Iran. The administration uses loud rhetoric, but there's little substance, I find, behind the tough talk. So if sanctions don't bring Iran to the table, what is the administration's plan B? For sanctions to be effective policy tools, they must work in conjunction with a broader diplomatic effort. And actually, I think diplomacy seems to be sidelined as a foreign policy tool. We see it again when it comes to the approach to North Korea. Despite the president proudly boasting success after the June summit, there's been no progress on denuclearization. In fact, it now seems the so-called success has turned into a failure. We need to think about how sanctions play into our broader strategy if we have one. What are we doing to exert pressure on our international partners to keep up multilateral sanctions enforcement? Do we have any reason to believe that sanctions will be enough to convince Kim to give up nuclear weapons without a broader diplomatic strategy to provide him a compelling reason to do so? What are we doing outside of sanctions to build trust and reassure the North Koreans that we're committed to peace? These are important questions, obviously, that needs to consider. Now, there is, of course, one glaring exception to the rule, and that's the one in which the Trump administration has been remarkably restrained in its use of sanctions, and that's Russia. To be fair, the administration has imposed new sanctions against the Russians, but the sanctions they have put forward, in my opinion, amounts to a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. In 2016, our country was attacked. Russia conducted cyber attacks to steal and disseminate information with the specific goal of helping Donald Trump win the presidency. They attacked our election institutions and flooded cyberspace with divisive propaganda, and they haven't stopped the assault. Our elections are vulnerable to Russian influence at this very moment. Now, I would be just as outraged if they try to help Hillary Clinton. I want them out of American politics. They are not our friends, they're our adversaries, and I don't want them interfering with our American democracy. And we haven't done nearly enough to stop it. The President has many sanctions tools at his disposal to punish the Russians for their attack on our democracy, and instead of using the full force of U.S. sanctions power, he cozies up to Vladimir Putin, the very man who directed this assault, the former head of the KGB in Soviet Union. And let me say, the executive order announced yesterday is not really an answer to this problem. It creates a complicated, overly broad process that will not do much to deter the ongoing attack on American democracy. It reminds me of being too little too late. I want to note that we in Congress could be doing more as well. My bill with Mr. Connolly, the Secure Our Democracy Act, is a response with real teeth. We introduced it last January when we first got a clear picture of what the Russians did in 2016, but it hasn't really moved. And here we are, less than 2 months from an election, and I don't think we've done nearly enough to tackle this threat. We're vulnerable to more attacks, and it's imperative that we act now. We need to punish those who attacked our democracy and work to deter future attacks. We need to incorporate a stronger sanctions regime into a broader strategy to deal with Russia's aggression and utter disrespect for international rule of law. So I'd like to know, when you answer these questions, what your agencies are doing to meet this challenge, as well as the other range of issues that I've mentioned. That's my statement. So let me take Iran and then Russia. Well, actually, let me do Russia first, and then Iran. Why is the administration not utilizing the full range of sanctions that Congress passed last year in CATSA, notably the sanctions on Russian energy projects and against Russian arms exports?
Thank you, Ranking Member Engel. I think I'll take the Russia questions, and Assistant Secretary Singh will
Could you
handle
put
the
your
Iran.
microphone a little closer,
Yes, sir.
please? Thank you.
So again, appreciate the chance to be here. I've had the opportunity every single time you've invited me to testify. I've been pleased to accept and appear before your committee.
And we appreciate it.
And it's great to be here. We look to your support on these issues. Look, on Russia, the numbers speak for themselves. The Obama administration imposed 550 sanctions over its 8 years in office. In the time we've been in office, we've imposed 223 sanctions. We've imposed 3 times as many sanctions on Russia for their cyber-related activities in our first 20 months as compared to all 8 years of the previous administration, 50% more on blocking actions, the same number of banks that we've gone after that they went after, 14 times as many Russians sanctioned for North Korea-related behaviors. And on top of that, as I described in my opening remarks, the oligarchs that we have targeted are the big fish. They are the inner circle around Putin. The message has been sent very clearly by the Treasury Department that there will be consequences and costs, including personal costs, imposed for the intolerable and unacceptable continued efforts to manipulate our electoral processes. We will not tolerate this. We will not agree to it, and there will be continued consequences.
What about the sanctions on Russian energy projects and Russian arms exports? Those really, the full range of sanctions that Congress passed have not been implemented.
So, Ranking Member, you're putting your finger on a very important issue. We have designated a few months ago Royce Export, which is the arms sale entity of the Russian government. It's the group that arranges all of the big sales. And we also designated their bank, the bank Royce Export controls, which has made it very difficult for them to engage in a number of transactions. We are, together with the Department of State, following very closely Russian sales pitches regarding the S-400 systems and other weaponry systems, and we've made incredibly clear to a number of countries around the world that purchasing those systems would expose their country under CATSA to possible additional sanctions.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask a quick Iran question. If any of the major buyers of Iranian crude oil, which is China India, Japan, South Korea, and Europe, if they refuse to sharply cut their purchases, are we really prepared to cut their banks off from the global banking system, which is the penalty under the U.S. sanctions? Are we really prepared for that? Ancillary question with that is, how would that contribute to our goal of constraining Iran, and how would it affect our relations with these countries, who are generally, some of whom are our friends?
Thank you, Ranking Member Engel, for that question. In response, we are prepared to take the most serious actions possible on Iran. We need to demonstrate to the Iranian regime that we will not tolerate its development of a nuclear program for illicit purposes. You know, as Assistant Secretary Billingsley has mentioned, the flawed Iran nuclear deal was determined not to be the right vehicle to address the range of Iran's malign behavior. We are having conversations with our allies, and our goal is to get purchase of Iranian crude oil down to zero by November 5th. That's a critical goal for us. We are talking with all of our allies, including the countries that you mentioned, helping them to understand that the only way that we can achieve this global goal of Iran's nuclear program not commencing is through partnership and cooperation with our allies, as you have indicated. So we are working with them. We're trying to explain to them that the bigger picture here is we need to work together on putting this pressure onto Iran, and the sales of oil are a critical way to do that. We are prepared to take the strongest actions possible on people who will not assist us in complying with this new range of sanctions that we are putting back into place. I also wanted to address your earlier question about cooperation with allies. Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mnuchin have directed teams from the State Department and Treasury Department to travel together. We visited over 30 countries so far and sat down with our government counterparts and talked through with them our withdrawal from the JCPOA. We're trying to help them understand what it means for them. We are trying to engage in all kinds of diplomatic conversations to make sure that our allies don't feel like we are going it alone. We're explaining to them that we need to work as a global community to address Iran's range of malign behavior. So I just want to assure you that it is a priority for Secretary Pompeo that we do this on a basis of engaging with our allies.
Let me ask you one final question. China is Iran's top oil purchaser. Will they get to zero by November?
We are working with all countries, including China, to get them to zero. We've made it clear that unless we act as a global community, Iran's behavior is not going to change. The JCPOA was not going to change Iran's behavior. We have a new strategy, a new list of behaviors that we are going to insist that they take, and we need cooperation from the global community in order to achieve this goal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Joe Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Singh and Secretary Billingsley. Thank you for your service, and it's so positive to hear your messages. And in particular, Secretary Billingsley, you mentioned about the impact of the sanctions. The President was very courageous to pull out of the flawed Iranian nuclear deal. So, Secretary Singh, you are absolutely correct. They never stopped their policies of death to America and death to Israel. And so it is just refreshing that we have a president who has made promises. He's keeping his promises to protect American families. In line with that, I was really impressed, Secretary Billingsley, with your presentation of the effect on the Iranian economy. Just extraordinary. And we're hopeful for the people of Iran that this great people of Persian heritage, that they can reestablish a free and democratic society. I also was encouraged, Secretary Singh, by your pointing out that visiting with 30 different countries around the world to promote cooperation, it somehow is misreported by the negative media that nothing's being done. So thank you. I hope somehow that might be picked up, and because it is really positive. And for Secretary Billingsley, What role do you see for Congress in the process of implementing the sanctions in line with the new policies? Are there any new tools that we could provide from Congress, which I think would be bipartisan, just as Ranking Member Elliot Engel did not approve of the Iranian nuclear deal? We have worked bipartisan together, particularly on this committee.
Thank you, Congressman. And your continued support, I think your support in the context of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I have to tell you how crucial it is that we have fully staffed embassies globally, particularly in the regions where we are dealing with Iranian aggression, Russian interference activities, and so on. It's not always the case that I'm actually able to engage with a confirmed ambassador in some of these key countries. So that would be an area for help. From a parliamentary engagement standpoint, as you work with other governments and other parliamentarians, reinforcing the need for countries to establish and enforce effective anti-money laundering regimes is so crucial. I can't tell you how important that is. I mentioned Panama, where there's a lot of offshore shell company formation in Panama, but other countries like Latvia, Cyprus, they need help as well, and they need encouragement. In terms of additional authorities, we'd be happy to work with the committee on that. I have testified in front of House Financial Services about the fact that I have found in previous positions the ability to offer rewards information that leads to the identification of suspicious bank accounts or other things to be a valuable tool in the counterterrorism context, so measures such as that might also be very helpful. One key point on maintaining, and I think Ranking Member Engel makes a good point about the importance of doing things in a multilateral context as best we can. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes we do have to act on our own to protect our own interests and equities. But in the case of Iran, it is absolutely the case that we enjoy broad support. We, in fact, received the support of all 6 of the Gulf countries to designate the Leadership Council of Hezbollah. That is something that has never happened before. That's a big deal, and we are appreciative for the Gulf nations that they are supporting us on the Iran portfolio.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And Secretary Singh, again, it was refreshing to hear your reports of working with other countries, how meaningful that can be. And particularly back to Hezbollah, it remains as one of the most deadly terrorist organizations in the world, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. In addition to funding from Iran, Hezbollah runs a sophisticated network of criminal activities to fund its terrorist activities in Lebanon and throughout the world. Secretary Singh, what are the steps by the department to stop flow of resources to Hezbollah, particularly from Iran?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. You've hit on exactly the type of thing that we are trying to prevent. We have found that cutting off Iranian access from the global financial system cripples its ability to funnel money to organizations like Hezbollah. As Assistant Secretary Billingsley has detailed, the fall in the value of the Iranian currency has also had a huge impact on the Iranian government's ability to fund illicit activities by terrorist organizations. One of our key goals is to prevent Iran from supporting an organization like Hezbollah.
Again, thank both of you for service. It's extraordinary. Thank you very much.
Mr. Brad Sherman, California.
I want to commend your work. Sometimes we just sanction an individual, and if that individual has no assets in the United States, we're just basically saying we have a no war criminals at Disneyland policy. That is to say, the wrongdoing individual will never be able to be a tourist in the United States. And I hope we focus more on sanctioning countries where we can go after the economy, maybe multi-billionaires who would naturally have business in the United States, but sanctioning a few individuals in St. Petersburg just means they'll go to Euro Disney instead of Disneyland in some cases. It's integral to build and important to build support for our sanctions. What worries me with regard to Iran is not only may the tool not work if you don't have support in Europe and Asia, but you may break the tool. If we inspire Europe to develop payment systems that avoid U-turn transactions at the New York Fed, then we won't have that tool to be effective in future sanctions regimes. in order to build support for sanctions on Iran, instead of focusing on the JCPOA, which Europe does not believe is a reason to sanction Iran, we need to focus on Syria, Yemen, and their terrible abuse of their own LGBT community. As to Mohan Air, it may not be enough to sanction the individual companies. You may have to sanction the airports. I'm told that Ukraine has finally stopped, given their dependence on the United States. That should never have happened. At least it's stopped. I want to focus on Russia. Many reasons to sanction Russia, from the Ukraine to Salisbury, England. And I want to focus, though, on interference in our election. I'm not just talking about influencing. Every country might issue a press release that would affect a U.S. election. We might conclude a deal with some country in October. That is natural and sometimes designed to affect a U.S. election. I'm talking here about interference such as false flag advertising, cyber theft, and attempts at manipulation of the tabulation of our votes. Mr. Billingsley, is it the position of the administration that the Russian state illegally interfered in the 2016 election?
That's my understanding of the intelligence community's assessment, and from everything I've seen, I think that's
Have we imposed a sanction on the Russian state for their interference in our 2016 election?
Yes, but let me explain how I'm getting to that yes.
Well, there are 19 individuals who, and again, this may just be they're not allowed to visit the United States as tourists, but there are 19 individuals who were sanctioned for wrongdoing in the cyber world, and that may or may not, if they had not even if we hadn't had a 2016 election, they might face the same sanctions for other cyber wrongdoing. Can you point to what's the strongest thing you can point to and say, but for the interference in our election, that sanction wouldn't exist?
Well, I'll give you some very clear examples. So Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency, which is the troll farm they were using to try to spin up the hate on both sides of the political spectrum, is a great example. But I've got many, many more if you'd like them.
What have we done? So you're saying that that's a sanction against the Russian state or against a Russian
The thing with the Russians, and I mentioned in my testimony how each of these countries is different in the way they set and operate. The Russians are
so they've interfered in our election, and we tell them that one little entity won't be able to get some contracts. That seems like responding to Pearl Harbor with a strongly worded message.
Taking their stock market down by 9% in one day is not a
do you support legislation that would prevent U.S. persons from buying Russian sovereign debt?
I would have to get back with the other part of Treasury that does the international affairs work to make sure we understand what the knock-on consequences of that would be for our banks and for our citizens who are heavily leveraged into indexed mutual funds.
Well, we'd obviously give those funds a chance to divest themselves, but obviously no additional purchases could be banned. Ms. Singh, China may be incarcerating as many as 1 million Uyghurs right now. Are we going to imply Majinsky Act sanctions? Did I say Russia? I meant China. China is imprisoning perhaps 1 million. Are we going to use the Majinsky Act against them?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. The State Department is very concerned about Chinese treatment of Uyghurs. We are encouraging the Chinese government through diplomatic channels to ensure that they allow the practice of freedom of religion, they respect human dignity.
But this is a hearing on sanctions. Are we going to sanction them?
Yes, Congressman. When it comes to sanctions rollouts, we are not able to preview what we might do, but I can tell you we are looking at the situation, and Global Magnitsky is a tool that we use to curb human rights abuses around the world.
It's peculiar you can't talk to Congress about what you might do, but I yield back.
We go to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank both of you for being here today. And, you know, when you look around the world, there's a lot of enemies that are, you know, not treating us real nice, and they're going after a lot of different systems, you know, our electoral system. And then you throw North Korea in there and what China's doing, to march around the world and take over global dominance. What we have done is this committee, and I think this committee's been great at passing bipartisan legislation out to give you guys tools, and we're separate branches of government, but yet we can work coherently together to accomplish that goal. And as you know, this committee has for years, regardless of administration, led the way on pressing for increasing pressure on North Korea. As the chairman, along with others on the committee, has passed H.R. 1771, the Kim's Act, and other bills to tighten the screws on the Kim regime. The Trump administration deserves credit for sanctioning the Bank of Dandong and others. And I have little doubt that these measures are what drove Kim to the negotiating table. I think that's pretty self-evident that he came to the table. Without question, we're playing a winning hand with strong sanctions, and we can't back off, and we're in a different situation now that I want to address. However, I'm concerned that we're not taking full advantage of our strong position. In May, Ranking Member Mr. Sherman on the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee and I wrote a letter to Secretary Mnuchin encouraging Treasury to target larger financial institutions that have been implicated in laundering North Korea's illicit funds with secondary sanctions. As you may recall, we specifically highlighted the Agricultural Bank of China and the China Construction Bank, given evidence that customers have used accounts at these banks to launder money for North Korea. To date, we have not received a response to our letter, and these Chinese banks remained unsanctioned. Do you have any idea or comment on where we're at with that? Is that going to happen?
Well, first of all, let me apologize if the letter has gone unanswered. That's
It's all right. I get that same response from my constituents occasionally.
So we'll get on that and get you the response. You're correct. We have not sanctioned those two particular banks at this stage. We have very recently designated a Russian bank for continuing to facilitate trade with North Korea.
Are we going after the bigger ones? Because secondary sanctions are some of the most powerful tools that we can have. And we can give you the tools.
Right.
We can give you the tools, but if you're not using them and it's at your discretion, are you looking at these banks as too big to fail or too big to sanction, I guess?
Definitely, you have to look at some of the Chinese banks and recognize that they have under their management assets that really, in several cases, dwarf anything under the management of a U.S. bank, the largest U.S. bank. So we have to keep that in mind, but that's not going to deter us. What I would say is, with a big bank, though, where they've got a lot of diversified activities, what we're doing is engaging in very specific discussions with the banks, particularly through their New York operations, to drill down into the particular account holders that we believe are North Korean related, to get them to expunge those people from their bank rolls. And we've made some pretty good progress along those lines, Congressman.
I know this committee is open to suggestions. If you need other tools, let us know, because if we're going to bring the North Korea conflict to an end peacefully, we need all people at the table, and we can't have China and Russia backing off and saying, you know what, we're not going to play anymore, and we're going to supply North Korea with these products. And if we're not using those tools in our arsenal, this is going to go down in history. 5 years from now, they'll say, well, President Trump did this and it was a failed attempt. We don't want to do that. We want this to come to an end. So what would it take for you guys to put more pressure on them? Or do we need to put more pressure on the Treasury or the executive branch?
We are going after entities on a weekly basis. Today's action that I mentioned on the slave labor in
Could you please speak into the microphone? Thank you.
Yes. So we are targeting companies and entities that are helping evade sanctions on a weekly basis. The drumbeat is persistent.
Okay.
We're not easing up in any shape or fashion.
Okay, and I hope not, and I look forward to your response on that. And the last thing is, we just passed on the House floor of H.R. 5576, the Cybersecurity Deterrence and Response Act. It lays the groundwork for what an attack on our infrastructure is, or cyberspace, and this will go right after any country, i.e. Russia, that's hacked into our system, and it lays out what can be done by the executive branch. I hope you look at that, because that's something we think will be passed out of the Senate, this Congress, and use that as another tool in your arsenal, because we'll do the follow-up and ask, why are these entities not being sanctioned? With that, I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. We go to Albio Ceres of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and thank you for being here with us today. I believe that sanctions are the way to go. and it seems like we pass sanctions and you're getting more and more work and more sanctions to look after. Currently, how many, have you hired additional people at the Office of Foreign Asset Control to investigate individuals that we're sanctioning and all these sanctions that, yes?
Congressman, yes, we have, but I would say we're tapped out. We're running as hot as we can.
So, I mean, do you have an adequate amount of people to handle the kind of sanctions that we're passing here?
We make do with what Congress appropriates for us.
That tells me you don't have enough. Who do you make that request to? Can we help you
It goes
in
up
any way?
through it goes up through the Office of Management and Budget, and they make the final.
Can this committee help you in any way? Because, I mean, it's important that we track all these sanctions.
100% agree, and we welcome all the help we can get on these issues.
You know, Nicaragua is the latest country in the Western Hemisphere that has turned on its people. Are the sanctions that we have put on some of these individuals enough? What else can we do to deter this kind of behavior?
Thank you. So the situation in Nicaragua is it's an outrage. They have killed more than 300 people in the past few months with targeted assassinations. The attack on the church is a good example. We have designated the head of the National Police and several of the other individuals, but we are digging into this because President Ortega and the Vice President, his wife Murillo, must be held to account for these outrageous atrocities.
Not only them, but I think the whole country. We should put some pressure on the government because, it's, you know, they're just squandering money, stealing money left and right.
The problem is those two are the government. There isn't anything else.
I know, yeah.
That's the problem.
And in terms of North Korea, you know, it's very interesting that I hear that he's calling around different leaders of the world now to assist them. Is that going to help them get by some of the sanctions that we're implementing on them? All of a sudden, he's become a very communicative guy, you know, in the world.
Congressman, we remain in very close contact with our allies and partners about maintaining pressure on North Korea. In fact, we've had 4 sanctions rollouts, sanctions designation rollouts since the Singapore summit. So our economic pressure from the United States government side has not relented at all. We maintain the sanctions that we have, and we are encouraging our allies and the United Nations to keep sanctions in place. The only time that the North Korean regime will see any relaxation of sanctions on their government is if we see a serious effort, a serious attempt for them to comply with our demands of denuclearizing. We've made it very clear to Chairman Kim what we are looking for. President Trump is committed to this result. So we are in constant contact with our allies and want them to share our posture of completely maintaining the economic pressure until we see the changes we desire.
And in terms of Russia, you mentioned a date before where the Russian have to conform to not using nerve gas on its people. Otherwise, you're going to put additional sanctions. Do you think that they're going to admit that they use nerve gas on their own people?
Congressman, at this point, it's not even a matter of Russia admitting it. We know that they did this.
Well, I know, but there's a date coming up that you mentioned before. I forgot the date.
It's coming up in November, and what we are looking for is an ability to conduct inspections, an affirmation from them that they will not use nerve agents on their own people anymore. And if we don't see this, the second rounds of sanctions is mandatory. Those sanctions will be imposed.
And what does that include?
It's going to include banking sanctions, prohibitions on procurement of defense articles, any sort of foreign aid money. There's a long list of things. It's a laundry list of items which will penalize the Russian government.
You're going to have to know more, you're going to have to need more staff, because I don't think they're going to admit that they're not. If they admit that they're not going to use it against their people, that means that they did it before. So I suggest you start getting ready.
We are prepared. We are absolutely prepared to fully implement this second round of sanctions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I just want to indicate that in raising the issue of what is going on right now in Nicaragua, I think that there is certainly cause for the international community to be very concerned. A constituent of mine recently raised the issue of an attack on the village where she previously lived, not by the Army, but these are private militia that come in and people are disappeared or they're subsequently found, sometimes tortured, sometimes killed. And she was talking about the circumstances there, saying it's reminiscent of the way Joe Stalin kind of went off the rails, and you ended up with anybody, any student who was suspect in Nicaragua now, or any worker who's suspect of not having fealty personally to Ortega, just being brought in by this private militia force. And so I'm glad you raised the issue today, because from a human rights perspective, pushback is essential right now, I think, on the regime. And I'm sure there are many within the government who are concerned about the fact that this is done not through the state, but it's being done through private militia activity.
Chairman, I just had in my office some of the victims of Nicaragua. They're using waterboarding, they're using sharpshooters to shoot people who are demonstrating, doctors who assist any of the victims of the demonstrations, they're going after them also. So I think I would love to work with you on something.
Thanks for raising this today, and I'll work with you.
Thank you.
Chairman, on that point, Congressman, they actually, the health minister issued an edict that wounded victims of their attacks would not be treated. I mean, this is how outrageous it is. Very quick, you asked another area where you could help. One area I would just put a plea in is every time you're looking at legislation, I understand that sometimes the compromise is, well, let's just get them to do a report for us. Obviously, that's fine. You need to have whatever information you need to have, but if you could just kind of keep in the back of your mind that some of these reporting obligations impose a huge workload on a very tiny staff.
So you need more staff.
Or if there are reports that aren't getting read anymore.
You can admit it, you know.
Maybe we could look at
need more staff. Thank you.
Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate our witnesses for being here. Whether it's the last administration, the current administration, or future administrations, I subscribe to the principle that it's important to always be pursuing a stronger, more consistent, more effective foreign policy from one month to the next. Sometimes we see an inconsistency from one country to the next, and this is something that's plagued American foreign policy for a long time. I believe that the President has surrounded himself with some great leaders who believe that we need to be strengthening our relationships with our friends, treating our adversaries as our adversaries. Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Mnuchin, Ambassador Bolton, all understand, as this President does, that we have the largest economy in the world and we can effectively leverage that. We're hearing a lot of good news about our economy. So while we hear about our markets hitting historic highs, unemployment hitting historic lows, consumer confidence hitting historic highs, GDP are the fastest growth in 4 years. At the same time, we're hearing about China and Russia and North Korea and Iran, the state of their economy, going in the opposite direction. And in many respects, it's effective use of sanctions. It's good work that's done at the United Nations with Ambassador Haley as well. Both of our witnesses, I thank you for your efforts. I believe that the President was correct in withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. It was here, actually, Secretary Kerry said that it was an unsigned political commitment. It was not submitted to Congress as a treaty. The reason that they decided not to do that was because they didn't believe it was going to get passed. That was the answer to the question of why is this not a treaty? The answer was that they would not have been able to get it passed. That was here in this room. I thank the administration for moving the embassy in Israel to the capital of Jerusalem, for the implementation of the Taylor Force Act, which a lot of good work here at this committee on a bipartisan basis worked to implement. I support Ambassador Bolton a few days back was talking about sanctions as it relates to the ICC. We have pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli entities that are out there that want to bring the United States up on war crimes charges and the Israelis up on war crimes charges, and effectively leveraging sanctions there is important too. And also, be remiss, and I don't want to steal Congressman Deutsch's thunder. He's the one that he always makes sure to bring it up because it's his constituent. But I think in our work with Iran, leveraging our sanctions and our interactions with them to return Bob Levinson back to Congressman Deutsch's district and to the Levinson family is very important, and I thank Congressman Deutsch for all of his work on that. But I want to ask you about, there were some news reports that came out that former Secretary of State John Kerry has been conducting shadow diplomacy with top Iranian officials to salvage the nuclear deal. This reportedly includes meeting 3 or 4 times with Iran's foreign minister. Is the administration aware of these meetings?
Thank you, Congressman. We've seen reports of those meetings.
Have the efforts by a former Secretary of State, John Kerry, or other former Obama administration officials to undermine the implementation of this administration's Iran policy using such shadow diplomacy, has it had any effect?
Well, Congressman, we remain focused on our new Iran strategy. You know, as I've outlined, Secretary Pompeo at the State Department has formed a new Iran action group. We have specific steps that we've outlined. We have a team at the State Department that is working with the White House, with the Treasury Department, with the interagency to make sure that we're focused on sending a message to the Iranians that the only way that we will ease up on the economic pressure, which is debilitating their economy and their leadership, because our goal, of course, is to hit the government, not the Iranian people. We want to see these changes. They have to show us that they are not developing a nuclear program, that they will release political prisoners like Bob Levinson, that they will promote political freedoms, that they will allow on-site inspections, that they will stop their aggressive behavior in their neighborhood, they will stop threatening Israel. They need to stop supporting the violent Assad regime, their terrorist activities in Yemen. We have a long list of things that we're focused on, and it's unfortunate if people from a past administration would try to compromise the progress we're trying to make in this administration.
Would that be improper for Secretary Kerry to be meeting with Iran's foreign minister with that shadow diplomacy?
Well, Congressman, I don't have personal knowledge of those meetings, but if that is happening, again, I would find it very inappropriate.
Thank you. I yield back.
We go to Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's actually the first I've heard of the shadow diplomacy taking place, but frankly, I'm not sure that it's such a bad thing that other people are trying to represent our country, considering the erratic nature of this administration. Anyway, I wanted to ask you a few questions about sanctions, and wanting to start with Zimbabwe, and wanting to know where we are with sanctions on Zimbabwe, and if there's any plans to reassess Zimbabwe's sanctions. I was just there for their election, and needless to say, there are numerous problems that happened after the election. But Zimbabwe is trying to reach out to us now, and I want to know where we are with that. I also want to talk to you about sanctions against Iran, and want to know if you are aware of the specific case of Noura Hussein. She is 19 years old. She's a Sudanese girl who was sentenced to death in May for fatally stabbing her 35-year-old husband that she was forced to marry when she was 15. There has been a lot of international pressure to stop her from being executed. She says she killed him in self-defense because she was being raped. And so I want to know, given that we have been considering changing our policy toward Sudan, if that is a leverage point, number one, to save her life, but where we are with sanctions toward Iran. Then I have a few other questions, especially for Mr. Billingsley. That was for Ms. Singh. Those are for Ms. Singh.
Thank you, Congressman. When it comes to Zimbabwe, we still have 141 individuals and entities, including the president and the former president, who are designated. So our pressure on Zimbabwe remains in place. We are trying to use this pressure to leverage political and economic reforms, human rights observations. And so the response to your question is basically, it remains on our radar. This pressure remains. We want to see fundamental changes in Zimbabwe, and only then will we resume normal relations with them.
And considering they want to move forward in that direction, I think we certainly have a lot of leverage right now, and we need to figure out how to step that up as well.
Thank you, Congressman. As with every nation that is subject to U.S. sanctions, we are always open to conversations. We are open to a demonstration from the government that it is changing its ways, that it is observing human rights, that it is taking—
Thank you. Before I run out of time, would you respond about Sudan? And Nora Hussein.
I don't have personal knowledge of this young woman. It sounds like a very unfortunate situation. The purpose of our sanctions, again, is to get these governments to properly observe human rights, and that would be in the case of both Iran and Sudan. I can look into the case of this individual woman and get back to you.
I would appreciate that because, they still are a state sponsor of terrorism. They still have that designation. And there are even forces within our government that think that that designation is actually problematic. And so it might be in the context of us examining that, raising her case as well, since they're very anxious to have that designation removed.
Okay, I will look into that and get back to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And for Mr. Billingsley, specifically from the Treasury Department's perspective, there are many human rights abusers in Africa that have tremendous wealth here in the United States, real estate and other financial investments. And I was wondering if we are beginning to track those.
We are, we are working very closely with a number of non-governmental organizations such as Sentry and others. In fact, I just was in New York with John Prendergast, who he presented to the Security Council on this very topic and on the matter of corruption at the invitation of Ambassador Haley. We are using the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Authority that was developed under the administration to go after these human rights abusers. I think one of the most notorious ones that we've targeted very aggressively is a weapons trafficker named Dan Gertler, who is profiteering in the Congo, and we've had a fairly significant effect on his finances as a result of our actions, as an example.
I appreciate that. I would like to continue to work with you on that and raise some specific cases, because although we target individuals for sanctions, I actually think looking at their assets here in the country would probably be a lot more effective than what we've done.
Also in Europe, too.
Exactly.
100% agree.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
We go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. If fully implemented and enforced, U.S. sanctions can be an effective foreign policy tool to pressure dangerous rogue regimes, including those in Iran, in North Korea, in Russia, as well as those in our own hemisphere, like my native homeland of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Regimes like these can both threaten our national security and the human rights of all those forced to suffer under their despotic rule. And it undermines the stability of key regions with significant consequences for our national security. And that's why I've worked in a bipartisan way alongside so many in this committee, especially under the leadership of Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, to author sanctions laws, including the strongest sanctions on Iran on the books, the Iran Threat Reduction and Syria Human Rights Act, as well as Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act. I'm also proud to have authored the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act and have helped secure the passage of the Sergei Magnitsky Act. The Global Magnitsky Act, authored by our colleague Chris Smith, has become a very important tool, and I'm pleased to see that the administration has made use of it, especially in Nicaragua. Following up on the excellent questions and observations of Mr. Sires and our chairman, what they were saying about Nicaragua, I would like to ask you if, as the human rights violations in Nicaragua sadly spiral out of control, how can we encourage responsible nations to implement similar sanctions? Then on Russia, while it's still not enough, I was very pleased that the administration just days ago, yesterday, finally authorized additional sanctions for those interfering in our elections. I do, however, strongly urge the administration to take it a step further and signal support for our Deter Act, which I introduced alongside our colleague Brad Schneider earlier this year, and Marco Rubio and Senator Van Hollen have it in the Senate. And this bill would ensure, as you know, that key Russian officials and oligarchs are sanctioned if Putin interferes in our electoral system again. So I'll ask you, would such a law requiring automatic sanctions be an appropriate signal that there will be severe repercussions for any future interference in our democratic process? And finally, on Cuba, it's been nearly a year since the State Department updated its list of restricted entities associated with the Cuban military. Is the administration looking at additional companies and entities to add to that list? And what additional sanctions can we use to support the people of Cuba? Thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, on Global Magnitsky, again, we appreciate the authorities that were given.
Could you put the mic a little bit closer?
Yes, Congresswoman. To date, we've designated 84 individuals and entities under Global Magnitsky, which is the, I think, signals our determination to combat human rights abuse and corruption wherever it occurs. And Nicaragua is clearly an outrageous situation, a truly atrocious situation. Venezuela, but Venezuela takes the cake. I mean, what they're doing to the people of Venezuela with 2.3 million migrants, an economy that's in a death spiral. They've stolen everything there is to steal from the oil sector, and now they're looting. They're stripping the forest and looting gold and whatever is left. Maduro and his cronies must be held to account. And to that end, Ambassador Haley held an ARIA-style session of the Security Council to put a spotlight on this matter, and please know that the Treasury Department we are all over this matter. You asked a key question regarding quote automatic sanctions. I have to say automatic sanctions, mandatory sanctions, are really not the way to go in our view. Simply because it's not because we don't want to designate these individuals. I think we've proven with our track record that we will not hesitate to go after these people, but we have to be able to synchronize the way we go after them together with the Department of State, but also together with our own financial diplomacy efforts. A lot of what we do are things you never really hear about or see as we are out preparing the battlefield for the imposition of the sanctions to ensure that we have maximum effect with partner nations. So appreciate the chance to comment on that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I just wanted to make a quick statement on the elections, because you mentioned the Deter Act. As you know, the President has signed an executive order. We very much share Congress's concerns, and I think the intent behind the executive order is similar to the pieces of legislation that are out there. We are all serious about preventing any election interference, and if we find out that election interference has occurred, we are very serious about imposing mandatory penalties upon those who have interfered with our democratic process. When it comes to Cuba, as you know, the State Department was very concerned about the health and security of our employees in our embassy there. We remain concerned. We are not convinced that the attacks on our embassy have ceased entirely. So our security situation there remains precarious. We are always evaluating new means and methods to be able to achieve the desired changes in Cuba. We have a long history of being able to try to work through these issues with Cuba. In fact, Congressman, I'm a native Floridian, and I grew up in Winter Haven, Florida. I went to the University of Miami, so for me, Cuba is a go Hurricanes, yes, it's a very personal issue, and one that I think we need to use the most effective tools to straighten out. I don't know at this time if we are looking at new entities, but I can assure you that we're constantly evaluating the process and the tools we have to change the fate of the Cuban people. And I can get back to you on
That would
if
be
there are
lovely, thank you.
additional potential.
And when we said go Canes, we don't mean Florence, we mean
No,
University
we
of
mean Miami Hurricanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had many witnesses, officials, former officials, international experts talk about sanctions in front of this committee. So I wanted to get a real clear distinction here. Was it a legal determination that you had to withdraw from the JCPOA in order to pursue these new sanctions on Iran for their malign activities, or was it a policy determination? I want to be clear, because we've had much testimony about this from some very credible people.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. One of the flaws in the JCPOA was that it was an agreement that was not approved by Congress, by the Senate. As you know, there's been much debate about that, and as was observed earlier just by this committee, it was...
Oh, excuse me, I want to interrupt. That's not what I'm asking. Don't go back to that issue. I'm saying, for what was in place with the JCPOA, was it a legal determination or was it a policy determination?
Well, President
Not
Trump,
what the JCPOA was.
Okay. Well, President Trump took a look at the JCPOA and determined that his policy would be to withdraw.
So it's not a legal determination. It was a policy determination. Are you clear on that?
Well, Congressman, lawyers have looked at withdrawal from the JCPOA as well, but at the end of the day, the President determined that this was not the right course of action.
That's not answering my question. This is not a tough question. To respond to the malign activities of Iran on other areas, you know, you did not have to legally leave the JCPOA. I don't understand. Everyone that's testified before us has said that. So are you agreeing with them or disagreeing with them?
Well, there was no compulsion to legally leave the JCPOA.
Okay, so it wasn't a legal determination. It was all policy.
Well, I guess I would say we were not compelled legally to leave it.
To do other sanctions on malign activities. So here's the issue. Why did you do it? Because one of the greatest strengths we have in dealing with Iran is our coalition. We pulled out of the JCPOA. We created a fracture with our Western allies. The strongest thing we have that no other country, frankly, that we compete with, China or Russia, has. And we didn't have to do it.
Congressman, I'm not sure the strength that you're referring to was there at all. Let me explain what I mean. And this predates me, obviously, but when the JCPOA was negotiated, the deal, quote unquote, with our European allies was that Iranian terrorism and Iranian ballistic missile activities and all of that other stuff would not go unchallenged, that it was still very much on the table for everyone to work together.
Excuse me, my time is running out. I'm asking the questions. May I ask you the question here?
Sure.
The question is simple. I mean, we have the power to do sanctions outside the JCPOA. The JCPOA is a discrete agreement about the nuclear program, not about these other activities. So it's clear. That's one separate avenue. Don't confuse the two. Don't conflate the two, because that's what I've heard all morning.
The two should not have been conflated, but they were. No, you're not right.
I'm not right. Tell me why I'm not right.
The European Union imposed not a single sanction on the Iranians since JCPOA was completed, not once. And I experienced this firsthand when we were trying to go after Iranian terror organizations, and the Europeans would refuse.
You're going right back to it. I'm talking about the agreement that was discreetly a nuclear agreement.
Every time
and you're
we tried
jumping back to something that we have
act.
Alternate sanctions for, and every other set of experts we had in front of us since I've been here has said the two things weren't exclusive. I'm going to move on to Russia because I take umbrage to you saying I'm wrong. I'm not wrong. And every expert that's come in front of us, before us, then is not wrong. So let me talk about Russia. You know, they placed sanctions on certain defense companies and enterprise. We had Mr. Sherman said clearly, you're not doing it on the state of Russia. So you did it on some defense industries, but you didn't do it, it was patchwork. You didn't do it on all of them. And why isn't the administration not implementing sanctions on, Sukhoi, which continues to enable Russian activities in Ukraine and Russian activities in Syria? Why are you making these determinations and leaving out companies that are constantly, they're doing it right now?
That's a great question. We are looking at Sukhoi. Obviously, we're very concerned that that their aircraft may have been used in chemical weapons attacks on innocent people in Syria, for instance. And if that proves to be the case, that's unacceptable.
Great. My time is up, but I would want to reiterate what the chairman and other people have about Nicaragua, the threats to people like Reverend Jose Alberto Adeguas and other people specifically are a great threat, and it's a continuing area we'd like to work with you on. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Chris Smith, New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our two assistant secretaries. You answered many of my questions previously today, so I'll just cut to one final set of questions. As you know, an effective sanctions regime presupposes financial transactions denominated in dollars, with the dollar functioning as the global reserve currency. China and its allies, however, have been attempting to attack the dollar, thus U.S. power, by supplanting it with the yuan. In Africa, for example, government officials from 14 African nations from Eastern and Southern Africa met in Zimbabwe earlier this spring to discuss using the yuan as a reserve currency. China recently engaged in a $2 billion currency swap agreement with Nigeria. And just a few weeks ago, African leaders met in Beijing, where they were offered $60 billion in Chinese financing, which includes a focus on African countries doing bond issuances in Chinese currency. This move away from the U.S. dollar regime is exacerbated by U.S. dollar shortages, which makes currency swap arrangements with China all the more attractive. China's interest in actually propping up corrupt rulers and helping them circumvent anti-corruption monitoring and eventually a sanctions regime, countless African resources are being sold in yuan without any global accountability. In Congo, Brazzaville, for example, the Congolese government signed a yuan convertibility agreement that allows Chinese businesses to operate in the 6-country Central African States region unhampered by a U.S. dollar regime. China's gambit has even been abetted by ostensible allies like German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who recently called for, quote, a global payment system free of the U.S. dollar. It appears that the U.S. dollar regime on which our sanctions system is built is under threat. I wonder if you could tell us what Treasury and State are doing to address this concern. And secondly, could the use of blockchain technology among financial institutions help with compliance with a U.S. sanctions regime? And I yield to our distinguished Assistant Secretaries.
Thank you, Congressman. On the currency swap issue, I mean, you're very much onto something of great concern to us as well. That said, there remains a great desire among most of the countries in Africa to maintain correspondent banking relationships with U.S. banks. And at the end of the day, they still, I think, are finding it necessary to ultimately clear trade in U.S. dollars. But it's the maintenance of those correspondent banking ties that is our best line of defense to ensure that we maintain not just a degree of transparency and visibility into the transactions occurring in Africa, but also for the effectiveness of our sanctions regimes, as you pointed out, but further to ensure that effective anti-money laundering standards are being applied and implemented. One of our big concerns in line with Chinese actions, not just in Africa, but around the world, are very opaque, debt-focused infrastructure transactions that we're not clear that some of the countries involved really understand the risks, the financial risks downstream of what they're committing to. So transparency in lending is another big issue. Finally, on blockchain, as with all innovative technologies, they're going to potentially be a great force for good and also a potential complicating factor for some of the regimes that we have in place. Distributed ledger technology is going to revolutionize the financial services sector, and we very much encourage that and look forward to that. And I think as it evolves, it will actually improve anti-money laundering regimes. But the same technology also underpins virtual currencies. And there is an urgent need for the world to really step up through the Financial Action Task Force and effectively regulate in a uniform way virtual currencies.
Thank you, Congressman. I'll just quickly second my colleagues' comments on both China and blockchain. We at the State Department remain very concerned about China's practices globally. We all know what happened with the port in Sri Lanka. It ended up being a very bad deal, a bad situation for the Sri Lankans. We've also seen recently that the country of Malaysia has not moved forward with certain transactions with China. We are encouraging our partners and allies to think twice before entering into transactions based on these simple examples.
Thank you. You know, having just returned from Ethiopia, having met with the new Prime Minister Abe, there is a concern among members of that government as well and others in Africa that this debt that is piling up vis-a-vis China is enormous. You know, but thank you for your answers. They were very, very incisive. I appreciate it. Yield back.
Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to both of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Chairman, thanks to you and the ranking member for, again, showing true bipartisan commitment to passing strategic sanctions that are aimed at achieving a targeted goal, targeted foreign policy goals, since sanctions themselves aren't obviously foreign policy. They're a tool to help us accomplish intended results. The sanctions were never meant to end Iran's nuclear ambitions. We needed to bring them to the table. And I just want to start with Iran and then ask a couple of questions about Russia. You'd said earlier that the goal is to get, I think Ms. Singh, I think you said the goal is to get the purchase of Iranian crude oil to zero by 11/5. So I'd just like to know, we know about the biting sanctions that are set to snap back on November 4th. I've spoken to some of our European friends who said that they're trying to understand what the administration is trying to achieve, whether we want constraints to continue on Iran's nuclear program. So the goal is one thing, how we get there is another, and if whatever the goal is, which we could talk about, if we're trying to get there by driving down the sale of Iranian oil and gas, the question is, what are we telling our allies? What are we, I guess the simple question is, do we expect that to happen? Do we think it's going to get to zero on November 5th? We've given time for this to ratchet down to zero. What's going to happen? And if it doesn't, then are we fully prepared to impose sanctions on our friends as well who don't comply?
Well, Congressman, thank you for that question. That's the purpose of the wind down period.
Right.
You know, we've had the 90 days, the 180 days. November 5th ends the wind down period.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a ratcheting down. It gives our partner countries a chance to seek alternate energy sources, but we are serious about penalizing the Iranian regime. This has been one of the methods that we've determined will impose the greatest cost on the Iranian
I understand. Have we seen that wind down? Have we seen it from our allies? Have we seen China take steps to wind down? And do we think we're going to get to zero on November 5th? And if we don't, then what?
Well, we are seeing cooperation from our allies, and if we don't get to, we are prepared to impose the second round of sanctions. I mean, we've made it clear that the wind down period is a time for countries to be able to comply with the sanctions that will be fully in place again. So we have seen some cooperation. For instance, we've seen 80 companies from the private sector.
I appreciate that. I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time. Are we prepared to sanction central banks in Europe if they maintain relationships with the Central Bank of Iran?
We are prepared to do everything that the JCPO withdrawal entails.
Should we expect it to happen on November 5th?
Well, Congressman, again, you know, we are prepared to fully re-implement sanctions.
On November 5th, if we're not at zero, and if those relations continue. Let me just ask, since I don't have a lot of time, do either one of you know whether the president brought up either Iran sanctions and cooperation on Iran sanctions, or our imposition of Russia sanctions in his meeting with Vladimir Putin?
I'm not sure that that topic was raised. All I can tell you is the guidance within the Treasury Department to continue the massive pressure campaigns has not changed.
Is it, and I ask this, I ask this honestly, I'm not trying to make a political statement here. It just seems difficult that you're doing the important work that you're doing, imposing sanctions, and the message coming from the White House about policy, not sanctions, but about policy, is seemingly stands at some points in contrast to the important work you're doing. So, for example, when we're focused on Russia sanctions because of what Russia did to the United States in our last election, and the president on a stage with Vladimir Putin says, I hold both countries responsible. I think the United States has been foolish. I think we've all been foolish. I think we're all to blame. It doesn't seem consistent with the work that you're doing. Is it hard for you to continue to focus on sanctions to get to a policy end when the language coming out of the White House, and in particular from the president, seemingly diverge from accomplishing that same policy goal?
Congressman, our policy throughout the administration is consistent, whether it's the Treasury Department, the State Department, or the White House. Our policy is that we will not tolerate and we will actively prevent anyone from attempting to interfere in our elections. The President has signed an executive order just yesterday imposing penalties for anyone we find who has interfered. We're taking proactive measures throughout the interagency.
I know, no, and
But I just want to make sure you know that the White House policy is consistent. We are all working together towards one common goal.
I'm just, okay, well, you obviously don't see any divergence. It just seems to me that that common goal is a lot harder for us to focus on when the President of the United States, when asked, do you hold Russia accountable, says, I think that that both countries are responsible, that the United States has been foolish. The message from the president should be entirely consistent with the policy that you're trying to carry out and that you, Mr. Billingsley, are trying to carry out. And too often, unfortunately, it is not. And I yield back.
But the president's policy is reflected in the executive order that he signed yesterday, Mr. Chairman.
Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is a terror organization, a terror arm of Iran. At one point, I know the administration talked about designating it as a foreign terrorist organization. I introduced a bill to do that and also a bill to sanction the IRGC. Can you tell me where the administration is on this issue?
Congressman McCall, we remained very concerned about the IRGC, as you've indicated. I don't have an answer to that question. I can get back to you.
But we, I mean, we are, the IRGC as an organization and a vast majority of its shell companies are already under Treasury sanctions, and we continue to target them very aggressively. The Quds Force, within the IRGC, the Quds Force, of course, is the source of the truly evil behavior in support of these various terrorist organizations, Qasem Soleimani leading that group. The thing about the IRGC also that I think really needs to be highlighted is their role in the endemic corruption within the Iranian economy. The case study of how the IRGC alone looted $5 billion from the municipality of Tehran and left them in a complete bind is not getting told to the extent it needs to be. So it's not just the terrorism outside of the country and the fact that they're moving hundreds of millions of dollars for terror operations globally and trying to conduct assassinations in Europe and other things. It's also what they're doing domestically inside the Iranian economy that needs to be showcased.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And yeah, if you could get back to me on that question. They've taken all the sanction relief money and funneled it into terror operations, 40% increase in military in Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, weapons, rockets being manufactured, on and on. On the issue of China, they steal about $600 billion annually from the United States, mostly intellectual property theft, technology transfer theft. They have a 2025 plan to be militarily and economically dominating on the world stage. Has the administration looked at sanctioning China for its theft of intellectual property? 20 million security clearances, including mine. And there were no consequences to that behavior. Yes, ma'am.
Congressman, we are very concerned. As you know, this is the highest priority for the president, is addressing the practices by China that steal our intellectual property, that steal our innovation, the forced technology transfer. Of course, we know of reports of Chinese officials coming here, taking technology back and reverse engineering them. As you may know, we've instituted a 301 initiative, which heavily penalizes China on many different fronts. We are utilizing the World Trade Organization, the WTO, direct bilateral penalties, the tariffs, the serious, significant, historic tariffs imposed upon China. All of these are economic measures intended to demonstrate to China that they need to take us seriously when we have directed them to stop stealing our intellectual property. Our companies should not be forced to transfer their technology in order to do business in China. Chinese companies are able to come do business here freely. Our companies should be able to go there as well. And as, of course, as you know, with the new FIRMA bill, the update of CFIUS, of the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S., we will be screening investment carefully through that mechanism as well, which will address some of the problems with the emerging technologies and the China 2025 program that you have mentioned.
When I was a young federal prosecutor at Justice, I prosecuted Johnny Chung, who led us to the director of Chinese intelligence putting money into the Clinton campaign. It's not the first time a foreign power has tried to influence our election. And that was, in that case, it was about technology transfer. It was China aerospace, satellite technology, and weapons. And so I just highlight that as an illustration. Finally, I think your job, Ms. Singh, is very important because when I talk to a lot of African ambassadors, they talk about China, and you talk about Sri Lanka, and they're in Djibouti, and they over-leverage these African nations and exploit their natural resources with their own workers, not the African workers. And then they can't pay these balloon-type notes at the end of the day, and then they take over ports and things like that. So I hope that you will encourage your ambassadors to be aware of this. And when I ask the question, why do you deal with China, they said, because you're not there. Americans aren't here. And I think your ambassadors have a role to play with respect to economic interests of the United States.
Thank you, Congressman. We hear that message, and in fact, I'm committed to trying to increase our economic engagement with Africa. So as you've indicated, they will have an alternative to China, because that is simply the case in many instances where African nations don't know that they can deal with us rather than the alternative of China. And I commit to you that we will make that a priority at the State Department.
Well, I applaud you for that. Thank you. I yield back.
Brandon Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hadn't planned on speaking about this, but I just want to echo 100% what Congressman McCall said, the last part. Anyway, as it regards to the dramatic investment China is making in Africa and the fact that we're asleep at the switch. Just had a constituent, a former head of the Philadelphia Black Clergy, come back, and he actually wants to come and speak to Congress about this because he was so alarmed at the foothold that China is building in Africa while we're doing nothing. But in terms of what I wanted to ask about, one of the real successes of the Obama administration was getting our European allies on the same page as it relates to sanctions against Russia, which is a bit of a challenge because they end up bearing a little bit more of the cost financially than we do, especially those countries that are closer to Russia. Given the deterioration in relations that we've had with some of our EU and NATO allies, I want to know what this administration is doing right now to make sure that we keep the Europeans on the same page as it relates to the hard-hitting sanctions on Russia.
Thank you, Congressman. We have very close relationships with the EU and our allies there. I think it's a myth that our relationships are deteriorating. We at the State Department engage—
Excuse me, reclaiming my time. It is not at all a myth. You need only have an off-the-record conversation with any one of the members of the ambassadorial corps and other officials, whether it's NATO, the European Union, I recently returned with a bipartisan delegation from Sofia, Bulgaria, as part of the European Union U.S. NATO parliamentary exchange or dialogue, in a group that has been going on for decades. And as one of their senior members who's been involved within the 80s, who's a member of a center-right party in Germany, expressed to me, he has never been more alarmed about the state of relations between a U.S. administration and NATO member countries. So anyway, what are we doing right now to make sure they keep the sanctions on Russia as they are an important part of their success?
That's a very important question, and I can tell you Secretary Pompeo is committed to working with the EU and EU member states to make sure that we impose costs and pressure on Russia. We have continuing, ongoing conversations with them about utilizing our sanctions authorities as well as United Nations sanctions authorities to work together to pressure the Russian regime to change its actions.
Yeah.
I'll give you a concrete example. I was just in Scandinavia together with one of Manisha's deputy assistant secretaries, coordinating actually on this topic. We rely very heavily on a couple of key countries within the EU to maintain that pressure and to maintain those sanctions. In fact, one of the things we have to work through with Brexit is that we're losing our Five Eyes partner inside the EU, and so we're actively exploring alternative approaches to have, really countries very actively supporting the continued pressure on Russia.
Let me, just in the minute and a half that I have remaining, shift gears toward Iran. One of the most encouraging developments that I've seen in Iran is what is happening on the street. These remarkably brave, ordinary Iranians who are protesting their own regime. They offer, in my view, real hope for potential for change in this awful regime that has ruined their country since 1979. I want to know, in what way is our sanctions policy working in coordination with that, and hopefully not at cross purposes with what is going on the street?
Well, Congressman, thank you for that. One of the things that we try to do, one of the activities that is exempted under our sanctions regimes are coordination and communications. We want...
Yes, right. Let me just clarify. I don't necessarily mean hard in campaign politics. We would distinguish between hard dollars and soft dollars. I mean more in terms of an independent expenditure, to draw the analogy, more in terms of the ways, not in hard coordination, but the ways that our policy complement the same goal that the protesters have on the street, not that we're necessarily in direct coordination with them.
I understand that, and our goal is very much to return the governance of Iran to the Iranian people.
Right.
The students that you mentioned, we believe that the students, the fresh voices in Iran, are the future of the country, and that's the example I was going to give you, is the communication that flows through them. So these ideas coming from the West that we support the people. We have a problem with the Iranian regime, the government. We support their voices. We support these students who want to take control of their own country.
Two additional points on that. They're protesting because Iran is
Mr. Billings, you've got to move the mic closer to so we can hear you. Thank you.
Congressman Connolly. The Ayatollah and his inner circle run the Iranian economy to their own benefit. And the protests in many ways reflect the fact that the Iranian people are fed up with that.
Right.
I mean, this currency peg where they actually favored regime insiders with preferential trading rates as the currency continues to weaken is a good example. So we are very focused on that and focused on calling out and also identifying the key economic players under the control of the Ayatollah and the Supreme Leader and the IRGC for additional pressure and sanctions.
We go to Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I applaud the sanctions applied to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. My bill, H.R. 4238, the Iranian Proxies Terrorist Sanctions Act, would apply the same EO 13224 terrorist sanctions on two of the most dangerous Iranian proxy militias in Iraq and Syria. Can you describe the effect of these executive orders, the specific sanctions that have already had on the IRGC, and do you support sanctions against Asa'ib al-Hel al-Flag and Kata Hezbollah Nujab Ba. Before you answer that question, I want to give you a little bit of background. Recently, congressional staff was in Baghdad, the fortress of the Baghdad embassy, and the embassy there scoffed at this legislation, saying they opposed the legislation. Soon after that comment was made, there were mortar attacks from Asa'ib al-Hel al-Fag at the embassy. So, do you take the same position as as Fortress Baghdad takes, or what is your position on these two terrorist groups that already have blood on their hands?
So, Congressman, I would, also as a former congressional staffer on the Foreign Relations Committee, I would never scoff at any piece of legislation. I'm not familiar with the particulars here. I want to look at it and get back to you on the details. I will tell you from the Treasury standpoint, we are very concerned about what the Iranians are trying to do with these paramilitary groups in Iraq. They are attempting to replicate the playbook that they've exercised with Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others by creating basically rival power sources in the form of these militias. We have been going after the different conduits in Iraq that the Iranians are using for terror operations, for financing. We took down, together with the Iraqis, who are actually really great partners on this, the central bank governor in particular, we took down one of the major banks that they were using to flow money through fairly recently.
Excuse me, my question is not about what we've done, it's about what we're going to do in the future. Two specific terrorist groups with American blood on their hand, do you think that they should be sanctioned or not? That's really just the question.
Look, if they've got American blood on their hands, we need to go after them. I need to dig into the details of what you have in your legislation, though.
Okay, that's a fair answer. Any other comment?
I would just echo my colleague, Assistant Secretary Billingsley's comments. You know, we would need to take a look at the legislation, but as far as these terrorist groups, we need to impose the most severe penalties as possible. We are very concerned about what's happened recently at our embassy in Baghdad, and thank you, Congressman, for recognizing that.
Well, I just want to reiterate, it's a little disturbing to me that the State Department, embassy people quickly scoff at going after terrorists, and I want to know whether or not that's still is that going to be the position of our government, or is our government going to go after other terrorist groups that have caused mischief, blood on their hands? The Iranians will do anything necessary, I think, to retaliate and cause crimes against folks, Americans and Iraqis in Iraq. And so I would appreciate a thorough response, or thorough study, and then a response from the both of you on this legislation. And thank you for both for what you do. I'll yield back to the chairman. Rest of my time, I know that's a shock to you, Mr. Chairman, but I yield a minute back to the chair.
Judge, thank you. You're a great example to the rest of us. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you. My good friend from Texas could have given me that minute. No, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Poe. And welcome both of you. And I didn't realize, Mr. Billingsley, we have something in common. You were a staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, an honored, revered title here, at least in this little corner of the world. I want to talk a little bit about the law and about cooperation. And
Congressman Manisha, too. She was general counsel over there.
oh, my God. All right. Well, God bless you, both of you. So, since you both helped write laws, when Congress passes a law and the president signs it, like he did CATSA, and I will remind you the vote was overwhelming. 98-2 in the Senate and 419-3 here in the House. That's about as unanimous as you're gonna get in the United States Congress at any time. So the president signed that into law. Would you agree that law is binding?
Absolutely.
We would.
Was that, I'm sorry, Mr. Bill?
I'm sorry. Absolutely.
Ms. Singh?
Yes, we would.
So it's mandatory, it's binding. So why then would the sanctions that are mandatory in that law, why are sections 225, 226, 227, 228, 233, and 234 not yet invoked? Only one of the 7 areas of sanctions has been invoked, even though we all agree it's the law of the land and binding?
So there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, these sections, these sanctions that are contained in those provisions are prospective, they're forward-looking. It does take us time. There's lag between when I get the intelligence necessary for us to put the packages together, but we will be imposing sanctions under those sections as we go forward. Another key point here, though, is that it's not just CATSA. There's a number of other pieces of legislation, actually dating from our time, and from your time as well, that are sanctions authorities. We also have executive orders that give us authorities, and we want to get onto the target as quickly as we can with as minimal fuss as possible to have the effect we need to have. And so while we may not have invoked a particular section under CATSA, the pertinent parallel executive order that predated, in many cases we have used those, and you will find sanctions imposed in many, many cases that are consistent with the intentions of CATSA, even if not formally under those statutes.
Okay, that's good. That's heartening to hear. I think that's the first time we've heard that, and that is heartening. Sometimes when going to efficacy, sometimes one wonders why we don't do certain things that are at our disposal. And let me give you an example. North Korea, to break sanctions, to continue to trade with other countries, needs access to ports. And that gets to marine insurance. And one of the tools at our disposal is to cut them off, that we simply will not allow marine insurance for their shipping or ships in a third country flag that do business with North Korea. We haven't done that. That's at our disposal, but we haven't done it. And that potentially could cripple their ability to cheat on sanctions. Are we looking at tools like that, even if Congress hasn't specified that? But they're clear and obvious tools that would significantly tighten the economic screws on North Korea.
Congressman, that's a very good point about the shipping sanctions, and we are considering all tools at our disposal. As you know, with sanctions, we look at everything very carefully, deliberately. A lot of times there's a pressure campaign. We start with certain sanctions and then we ratchet up. In the case of both Russia and North Korea, we are determining how our sanctions will have the most bite, and we progressively increase the pressure to have the maximum amount of effect. And, we agree with you about the North Korea, the shipping sanctions. That is something that is fully under consideration. We want to use absolutely every tool, and as you have very correctly observed, that would be a strong tool to seriously impact the North Korean regime.
Well, in my last 25 seconds, let me also just make a statement. I could not disagree with Mr. Zeldin of New York more. By ripping up a nuclear agreement with Iran, negotiated with our allies, that was working, and negotiated with our adversaries, China and Russia, it was actually working, it was verified as such. I think it makes it harder to get compliance with allies on sanctions when we rip up our own agreement, our own U.S.-led agreement. I think it makes us less reliable, and I think, frankly, it dilutes the efficacy of sanctions we want to reimpose. So I think it was a very misguided and mistaken decision, and I wish Mr. Zeldin were here to hear that. I thank you both for being here, and thank you for your wonderful service in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ted Lieu of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Russia continues to supply arms equipment to Russia continues to supply arms equipment to Syria as well as Iran. And my question to you is, how much has the U.S. sanctioned Russia for providing those sorts of assistance to countries like Iran?
Assistance to Iran, not so much, but what they're doing with Assad, we've targeted the main export engine of the Russian government, which is Rosoboronexport, and their bank. They control a bank, and we sanction them for in connection with the atrocities Assad has committed. That's actually complicated their ability to conclude a number of arms deals around the world.
So I've been told there is a Russian company, Sukhoi, that has provided support to Iran. What's the reason we haven't sanctioned that company?
Well, so Sukhoi fighter jets are all over the place, not just with Iran, but also Sukhoi passenger jets are in service here in the United States and other places. So I think we need to kind of keep that in mind. As I responded to a similar question earlier on Sukhoi, we're looking into that very carefully because we cannot agree that any Sukhoi support is given, particularly if chemical attacks are launched on citizens, innocent people in Syria.
Okay, thank you. So I note that you're the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Terrorist Financing of Financial Crimes. So let me ask you a few questions on money laundering. The Russians and the Kremlin, they do engage in money laundering, correct?
Correct.
And is one of the ways they do it by buying up real estate in the United States, such as condos?
That is a persistent suspicion we have. That is a really hard challenge for a variety of reasons, but in line with that thinking, we have established a series of geographic targeting orders that are designed to have the real estate community conduct due diligence into who really is underneath these various real estate transactions, and they have to report that back to FinCEN. And very recently, my office made the policy recommendation to reduce, to get more reporting by reducing the dollar threshold for that reporting obligation, because it's not just in the case, it's money laundering in general where we see real estate is a favored vehicle for value transfer.
Does your office investigate these kinds of allegations?
My office is the policy shop that also handles all the international engagement, but within the territory of the United States, the part of the Treasury responsible for the investigative functions would be the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN.
There has been some public reporting that a significant number of Russians purchased a lot of condos owned by the Trump organization. Are you aware of that?
I've seen press reports on that, but not just, I mean, all over New York.
And do you know if that's true?
I don't know if that's true.
Okay. I'd like to move on to North Korea. The president has engaged in a trade war with China. Have you seen China lessen their sanctions against North Korea, or China taking other actions to help North Korea in the wake of the current trade war with the U.S.?
Well, we remain committed to having conversations with China to instill upon them that we need their cooperation on North Korea, including decreasing trade with North Korea.
So I've been at various briefings where some of the experts have said, in fact, China has been helping North Korea more than they used to. Is that true?
I think the president's been very clear that he needs to see China step it up.
Has China engaged in more trade with North Korea in the last few months than they have before?
I think we're watching the cross-border traffic very carefully, and I think we're concerned about that. The big thing to focus on, though, is the ship-to-ship transfers in the China Sea, and we need to see more policing to disrupt those transfers, because that's how North Korea is getting around the UN Security Council oil sanctions.
Have more North Koreans been allowed to work in China in the last few months?
I don't know about more working there, but they continue to operate there, which is why this very morning we sanctioned an IT sweatshop, actually a couple, one of which was operating in China, another in Russia.
Has China ever said or implied that if this trade war gets worse or continues, that they will take certain actions in North Korea that the U.S. may not like?
Well, Congressman, I think I can address that. We're keeping those dialogues separate. We need cooperation with the Chinese on North Korea. It is just as much in their interest to have a denuclearized North Korea as it is in ours. Our trade conversation with the Chinese is separate. As you know, our trade issues with the Chinese have been going on for decades. We've been having conversations with them in the form of a strategic economic dialogue, a strategic and economic dialogue. So this president came in and decided that conversations with China were not working. He was going to have to take serious action on our intellectual property, on the theft of our innovation from American industries, their state-owned enterprises, all the litany of things that you're aware of. So our trade conversation is happening. We still expect full cooperation on North Korea. We've told the Chinese that it is very much in their interest to cooperate on North Korea as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Tom Swazi of New York.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. Thank you, Ranking Member Engel, for holding this hearing. Thank you to our two witnesses today. You've got big portfolios, a lot of different things to focus on. I'm really mainly focused today on Russia and its malign activities in Europe and Eastern Europe. Because of our focus in America on the partisan issues related to the 2016 elections, I think we've lost focus on how much Russia is doing to undermine democracies in Europe and Eastern Europe, and I think we need to call more attention to that. And I just want to use your language, Ms. Singh. Russia poses a threat to our national security on many fronts. We have witnessed Russian aggression globally, threatening our partners and allies. Russia is just as grave a threat to our European allies and other partners, from conducting targeted chemical weapons assassinations in the UK to using energy as a weapon. And Mr. Billingsley, I just want to quote from you the different remarks that you put in your testimony. Russia continues its occupation of Ukraine and Crimea and subversion of Western democracies. And for decades, Russia has been developing complex and resilient networks to raise, transfer, hide, and obscure the origin and movement of proceeds generated through illicit financial activity, including corruption, sanctions evasions, and arms sales. The scale and sophistication of Russia's malign activity is far more advanced than that of other states currently subject to broad U.S. sanctions. And so I got a report from the Congressional Research Services about the sanctions, which designations have been made and those that have not been used. And you talked earlier before about the use of executive orders versus CATSCA. And I want to ask you, first of all, do you think that we're doing everything that we can do? Because when I look at the sanctions that we've only done broad sanctions on 9 out of 100 of the largest companies in Russia. And we've only used more targeted sanctions in 23 out of the top 100 companies in Russia. And I wanted to suggest that we could be using some more sanctions related to Section 224 of CATSCA related to the specific area that I'm talking about. So my question is, do you think we're doing everything we can do? Can we do more? And do you have enough resources and authority to do everything you think you should be doing, for both of you?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll start off very quickly. We do have the authorities, and we're continually exploring what more we can do to ratchet up the pressure on Russia. I would say when it comes to actually imposing sanctions, just the fact that we have these authorities and our ability to implement them has given us significant leverage. We have seen that Russia has lost billions of dollars in transactions from the private sector because our companies know that they would be subject to our CATSA sanctions, the primary.
But they continue these malign activities, so the question is, can we do more, and should we be doing more, if only 9 of the top 100 companies have the broad sanctions against them?
I think, Congressman, we should be doing more. I think we should be increasing the pressure on Russia.
And do you have the resources to do that?
We do have the authorities that we need, but
Not
we're
the
always—
authorities, the resources. Do you have enough personnel in order to be implementing these sanctions against these large companies?
Well, the State Department is known for using limited resources very wisely. We deploy our personnel very effectively.
Okay, so you don't have enough resources. How about you, Mr. Billingsley?
Thanks, Congressman. One key point, though, is the size, particularly in the cyber domain where you're focused on 224, the size of the company may not really be the right metric. It's sort of what they—
I'm only suggesting that as one thing that's got very broad applicability to this particular area, but you've got other authorities that have not been any designations under CATSCA that you could be using, I believe, to try and hold these companies accountable. But continue.
Sure. No, but 224 in particular has been a very valuable authority that you gave us. We've used it in 9 cases so far against Russian cyber actors, and then there have been a variety of other areas where an executive order or some other legal authority got us onto the target faster, so we used a different avenue. But in total, we've gone after 34 of these cyber players for various—
Do you think you could be doing more?
Absolutely.
Do you have the resources necessary to do that? Do you have enough personnel dedicated to this function?
Would love to work with you on that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple of questions that I hope both of you will comment on, and I'm sorry to be jumping continents. Mr. Billingsley, I'm very concerned about the current situation in Guatemala. As you may already know, the president of Guatemala, President Morales, has been working with a group of corrupt politicians to undermine the fight against corruption there, and specifically the work of CSIG. I worry that if we don't do more to deter this backsliding of the rule of law, Guatemala could break down into chaos, and we could see the real crisis, or an even bigger crisis, at our southern border. So my question is, what is the role of sanctions in our policy towards Guatemala, and what kind of sanctions would be most effective in making clear that the U.S. will not stand idly while Guatemalan president and his cronies allows years of progress to be turned back, utilizing our own equipment that was gifted to them?
So, Congresswoman, you've put your finger on a really crucial issue. Ultimately, the Department of State is responsible for CSIG and the reformation process there. But we're watching the situation very closely. The tools we have would include, among other things, if we identify a financial institution that's being used to launder funds and it's touching the U.S. system, then the various provisions of the Patriot Act are available to us to go after. We do expect and demand that Guatemala implement anti-money laundering regimes and reforms. And then in the event that we see and can document, and working with the prosecutor can document corruption actions, the Global Magnitsky Act in particular is the tool that we use to impose consequences on people for those kinds of actions.
I certainly hope that your office is closely watching the actions. I'm very alarmed at what is going on right now with the Army mobilizing within the Capitol. Missing.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We are very concerned about what is going on in Guatemala, and we are looking at CSIG. The U.S. supports a reformed CSIG. We want to see more transparency, oversight, and accountability. It's an institution. It's an entity that should transfer more of its capacity back to the institutions, but we do share your concerns, and we are monitoring the situation closely.
I'm not sure what you mean by transparency, and although I do agree that more of their work after 10 years should have been already transferred to the Guatemalan institutions. However, I do want to point to you, and I'm sure you already know, I don't have to educate you on this, is that the Guatemalan Congress has not been able to pass laws to address their own issues of corruption and transparency. So how do we, on what ground do we stand to say transfer the power of authority to an institution that has shown that they are willing to be on the record to find themselves or to refuse to allow themselves to be put before a court to investigate their own crimes?
Congressman, you raised a very good point, and that's exactly what we're looking at. We do want to find ways to increase the oversight and accountability for the entire situation.
Please don't miss that mark. I think, you know, a lot of times, you know, we've done a great job, but sometimes we have, it's like head in the sand. And when we don't send a very, very clear message, then we end up with people coming to their own understanding on things that we do not want to empower the drug cartels, and we don't want to empower what is happening there now. So I want to just, you know, be very clear with both of you that if we don't do anything now, if we continue to stand idle and allow them, you know, to move forward with their effort of intimidating reporters, of intimidating human rights people that are, you know, activists, then we are responsible for what ends up happening there. And we will continue to be responsible for the number of children that are being held in ICE cages in our southern border. And that is what we need to, that is the bigger picture that we can't lose sight of. And Mr. Chairman, I've ran out of time, so.
But thank you, Congresswoman Torres.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
And again, we thank our panel, and the committee stands adjourned. We'll see everyone at 12:30 for our markup.